The more stories you can tell, the better. So stories are basically a way to essentially plant your emotion in somebody else's brain. I won't get into all the research and science behind it, but it's a way to transport emotion and have somebody feel what you're feeling or what they should be feeling. So the more stories you can tell around somebody else like them that did something similar, because we all want to know what people like us are doing, the more effective the delivery of that's going to be.
Welcome, Model FAs. David DeSell here, president of Model FA and the host of the Model FA podcast. Appreciate everyone tuning in today. Appreciate all of the support over the last couple of years of the show, and even more specifically over the last year of the show since I became the host. All that hard work with content, as well as our guests and your listenership and sharing is really starting to pay off. I've mentioned this in a couple recent episodes, but ranked in the top 2.5% of all podcasts globally. And that's because of all of you. So thank you. With that being said, really excited to bring today's guest to you, Brendan Frazier. Brendan is the founder of Wired Planning. He's also the host of the Human Side of Money podcast, which we'll be talking about quite a bit today. Keynote speaker, and was named one of Investopedia's top 100 financial advisors. He currently helps financial advisors around the world master the human side of advice. And we're going to unpack, what that actually means to Brendan and what he helps folks with. And he helps them with the human side of advice in order to enhance client outcomes and ultimately ignite growth in their business. So with that being said, Brendan, appreciate you joining. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here. Been a listener for a while now too. So it's always cool to get to be a part of the podcast that have helped you and benefited you before. But I do think there's an important point in something you said a minute ago. It's the fact that you're now in the top 2.5%.
Yep.
And that didn't happen until you became the host. So is it correlation, causation? I just want to point that out. It's an interesting fact.
I don't necessarily want to say, yes, it's because of me, because it's not.
I know.
We have a fantastic team that helps with the editing and post-production and all that type of stuff. So they have a hand in it, obviously guests like you and then all the listeners. But I will say, as a roundabout answer to your question, that we did just find that out recently. So I guess, the folks who are listening in can read between the lines.
Yeah. Well, but as somebody that hosts a podcast heavily guest based, you always think about none of it's possible without the guests, right? You got to have great guests on. Without the guests, it's kind of in fact, I have a few solo episodes and I'll go back and look at the numbers, and inevitably the episodes with guests get far better listenership than the ones that's just me talking. But anyways, just wanted to say, the work that you're doing, and it's cool to hear you're having the success that you're having.
Appreciate it. It's also good to have a fellow podcaster on the show because, everyone who's listening may not notice this, but I can see you and you actually have a legit podcast set up and a mic and headphones. So ensures some good quality audio. But I guess with that being said, Brendan, help our listeners understand, how'd you come up in the business initially? So you're helping advisors now, but how'd you get started?
Yeah. So I really wish that I had one of those really cool stories that you could tell a great story about, and it's really emotional and you sit there and you're like, man, this is what it's all about. Right. But it's honestly not that cool. I played baseball in college. Always thought that I was going to play baseball for about the rest of my life. Right. Everybody does when they're kind of that age. So I didn't really think about what the heck I wanted to do once I was done with that. But it became pretty clear pretty soon that baseball wasn't my path. So basically when I graduated, just thought I'm going to see what jobs are out there. But we had a family friend who was a financial advisor with Merrill Lynch. I always kind of thought the stock market seems kind of cool, but didn't really know if that's what I wanted to do. So I got a job, like a lot of people, I think, in this industry. I was offered a job at a financial advice company where they were basically just saying, hey, we're going to hire 10 and hope 2 stick model. Right. So looking back on it now, I thought it was cool that I got a job. I didn't realize that there's very little cost out of pocket to the firm. But so that sort of whet my appetite a little bit. I'll kind of fast forward. Didn't end up actually starting my own business or own practice. Instead, shifted to the wholesaling or product partner side in annuity industry. So ended up working at a company called Jackson. And that's really where I became aware of how much I was passionate about the industry and everything that we were doing, the way we were impacting clients' lives, the way that we were able to help advisors in their business. And so I did that for about 6 years and was able to talk to, work with, and consult with advisors around the country. So it's basically just this crash course in how do people run their business. I got to learn a ton about advisors, how they do things, how they work with clients. You get to hear all the good and all the bad. You get to realize that there's a lot of people out there you would never want to touch your money, but there's some out there that are great at what they do. So it was a really eye-opening experience to get to see that aspect of, or just you take anything and see it 1,000 times and you start getting some cool insights, right? I did that, ultimately decided I was traveling a lot. We were about to have our first son. I didn't want to be in Lexington, Kentucky, calling my wife on the way back from his baseball game, asking her, hey, how'd the baseball game go? I wanted to be there. I wanted to be around, or at least have the option to, right? Kind of became, all right, what am I going to do now? What's next? And so I remember talking to thousands of advisors over the years. There's a lot of themes that come up, but one that stuck with me, and I don't know why, was this common feeling or phrase or understanding of hey, Brendan, I know I'm a financial advisor, but sometimes I feel more like a therapist. Or they'd say Brendan, I've got this degree in finance or economics. And I know that part, but sometimes I think I'd be better off if I just had a degree in psychology than in finance. Right. And so it would keep cropping up time and time again. And so I just eventually would start asking I hear that a lot. So I'm curious, what do you do about it? I hear what you're saying. What's the solution? What do you do? And they would always just be I don't know. Just kind of wing it. Maybe I've read a book. Maybe I watch somebody else and see what they do. But there's this obvious need or obvious feeling of, I just don't really know where to go and what to do. But nobody would say that it wasn't important. Nobody ever said, Brendan, I tell you what's not important in this job is the fact that people have emotions, and money is an emotionally charged topic. Everybody knows that that's true if you work with people and their money long enough. And so that's kind of what prompted it. I thought, there's a need out there. There's a demand for it, or it seems like it anyways, to get better at this aspect of the relationship that I call the human side of money, or the human side of advice. Also, I'm sure probably a lot of people call it that. That's not some cool phrase, obviously, but I think it helps kind of sum it up. And so I just thought, I'm going to try to build what I would want if I was in that position. The podcast, for example, it's the podcast that I wanted to listen to. So I just thought, well, I'm going to build it, learn from it, and hopefully some other people learn along the way. And that's kind of just a classic business case of hearing what people needed and didn't have and trying to fill the gap.
So let's dive deep into the idea of the human side of advice. And I remember when I was in college, I majored in finance and minored in psychology. And once I became an advisor, I was like, oh, well, that worked out unintentionally well. The money, the people side of the business. But when you reference the phrase human side of advice, what does that mean? And then we're going to dive, much deeper as we continue along.
Yeah. So that's kind of the challenge, right? Is it means a lot of things. So trying to sum it up, we all get trainings and designations and certifications on technical knowledge, right? How to run a Monte Carlo simulation, how to help somebody plan for college, how much do they need to save to retire? How can you minimize their taxes? You can go and get all the trainings and designations that you want on that. The human side of advice is everything that you didn't get taught in a training that you absolutely need to know to best serve your clients and grow your business. So what that means is it's the behaviors that may be impeding somebody from doing the things that they're supposed to do or that they want to do, right? You can't just give somebody a financial plan, say, hey, here's where you are, here's where you want to go, here's your plan to get there, do these 5 things, and you'll be able to retire in 10 years like you said you wanted to. You can do that, but the plan's not sufficient. Information is not sufficient. The reason everybody knows what happens is you tell somebody what to do, but they don't always follow through on it. And that's not a money problem. That's not a spreadsheet problem. That's a mindset problem or a behavior problem, right? So just something even as simple as improving follow through and implementation as far as your recommendations go, that falls into the human side of advice. Another thing would be, I had a conversation right before we hopped on here, a couple that's about to retire and they've got more money than they could ever need. They don't spend anything. Right. And so he's having conversations with them, trying to show them hey, you can go and spend exorbitant amounts of money on whatever it is that you want to do because you literally can't run out of money. And I know most advisors also have seen or heard this situation too. And you can show them all you want. Hey, look at this projection where if we take out $40,000 for a vacation this year, you still have all the money in the world, but there's something mentally going on, right? It's their psychology of spending that's preventing them from actually being able to live the life that they want to live. Or another good example, I think, is being able to build trust and build connection with people in a way that gets them to open up that gets them to trust you and tell you the things that are most important to them, to tell you how they think and feel about money. I like to give some examples, but if I was going to sum it up, it would be building trust and connection with clients and prospective clients, unearthing values and emotions around money to give people a clear vision of what's important to them. And then ultimately delivering advice that people are able to follow through on, where they actually change their behavior and do the things that they're supposed to do. Nothing that you find in most designations, trainings, and certifications.
So it seems like, if I'm interpreting this correctly, most every advisor has a pretty well-defined service model that's kind of like the logical aspect of what the client goes through, from an introductory call to ultimately signing on the dotted line, so to speak. And it seems as if what you're hitting on with this human component is ensuring that along the way, there's a focus on what that client is experiencing or feeling in order to drive them to action. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, that's a big piece of it, right? Is that one of the quickest ways to ignite behavior change is to give somebody a clear vision of their why, right? Like nothing fuels behavior and increases motivation quite like giving somebody the why behind what they're doing. That's definitely a big piece of it. The other big piece of it is just truly being able to help somebody uncover their why and the things that are most important to them, so that you can align their money, align their finances with those things. Now, it takes some skill to get somebody to uncover that, right? It takes asking great questions, listening well to hear like where the emotion is and what people's saying. You're doing it. A big reason why is to ignite their behavior change. Another thing is you're truly helping them figure out what is most important, because now you can align their financial strategies, if you will. You can align their money decisions with the things that are most important. They now have a filter to make their decisions. So I'll give you a good example from my own life, right? So 2 years ago, we were going to move. There's a house that's in a certain area of town where we wanted to live, and our in-laws were 5 minutes down the street. We have kids, or my in-laws are down the street. Some people may say that's a negative, but there's another house that was 20 minutes away from our in-laws and about $50,000 cheaper. So if you look at it just strictly through the lens of a spreadsheet, if I was strictly to look at the numbers and say, hey, what's the financially sound decision here? You would look at it and go, well, that other house is cheaper. You have a lower monthly payment. You can pay it off sooner. You get more money back in your budget. Well, that's true. But what's important to my wife and me that we've uncovered, that we know, that we now use as a value filter to make our decisions, is spending time with our family, especially now that we have kids, and having them nearby is of utmost importance. And I'm not going to say it's priceless. Like there's probably a price point where we weren't going to be able to pay. That's a decision that may not make sense on a spreadsheet. By the way, we bought the house. It was more expensive to be closer to family and friends too, by the way. But that's a decision that if you looked at it on a spreadsheet, it would look outrageous. You'd be like, why would you spend $50,000 more on a house when the other house is probably nicer and you can pay less? But it wasn't about that. It was about knowing what's important to us and using that as a filter to say, all right, we're going to buy the house that's aligned with our values.
I can relate to that. When I was waiting for my new place to be built, I was kind of in between point where I had to move out of my other place. So I went to another location in Florida about 40 minutes away where it's a lot cheaper. My dad has a condo there. So I was able to post up there for a couple months. And I thought to myself, I was like, well, it's way cheaper to get something down here. Like, what if I just lived here? But everything that I like to do and my friends are in St. Pete, and that 40-minute drive wasn't worth it. So I was like, I would, much rather pay more and be in this area. So I hear you on that example, but more specifically for advisors, let's focus on the discovery process. So you figure, the intro call, the discovery meeting, basically your information and feeling gathering interactions that you have with these prospects before you get to even present them anything. What are some of the best practices that an advisor can do at that stage in the process to really focus on the human side of advice?
Yeah, this is where we do a lot of work, where most people want the most work done or help with, is this part of the process. I mean, I could go on and on with this because this is a lot of the conversations that we have and a lot of the coaching that we do, but I'll try to boil it down into some of the main things. But I think most importantly, first and foremost, number one, you've got to start with, in that situation, what's going on in the client's mind or prospective client? What is it that person wants? I can promise you that the number one thing that they want and need in that situation isn't to hear about your customized, holistic, comprehensive financial planning process or your perfectly asset allocated, diversified, risk managed portfolio, right? What they do want, what their brain's sitting there thinking is, do I trust this person? And do I feel the certainty to know that they're the person that's going to solve the problems that I have to deliver the result that I want? Do I trust them? Am I certain that they're going to deliver the result that I want and solve the problems that I have to get there? And so doing that requires building trust, right? Obviously, they want to know that they can trust you. It also requires delivering the certainty and letting them know that you're the expert, that you can 100% solve their problems. The biggest issue that most people make in that first meeting is they create what we call reverse rapport. So we all know, we've all heard about the importance of creating rapport, right? You just have to look at it correctly. Creating reverse rapport is when you try to be liked more than trusted, right? So you're sitting there, you're like talking about, well, who's your favorite football team?
Well, it depends. Patriots. And then I moved to the Tampa Bay area. So I got season tickets to the Bucs to see my boy, Tom Brady. But since he's left, I'm kind of in between right now, but let's go with the Pats.
So you moved to Tampa to follow Tom and then he retires.
No, I moved here and he happened to follow me.
Oh, that's what it was. Okay. Yeah. All right. It's kind of like, so there's a famous actor named Brendan Frazier. Some people are going to know that. Some people are going to be like, who the heck is that? But I always joke that he was actually named after me. He might be older, but he was actually named after me. But
there you go.
So if you're a prospective client, if I was to sit here and be like, oh, you're a Pats fan. Okay. Yeah, that's cool. What do you think they're going to do with Ramondre Stevenson next year, the running back? You think they're going to use him a little bit more often? Like, what I'm searching for there is connection. And that's fair, right? Like, that's totally fine. You want to build some sort of connection, but like, you ultimately don't care if I know a thing or two about how the Patriots are going to use their running backs next year, right? Like, it's this psychological problem where we all default to it because it's easy to kind of keep searching and searching for that. But people they want trust and they want certainty. And so I'm not saying that you should just launch in right out of the gate and go, hey, what are your most important goals in life, right? But you need to have a thought out process for establishing trust and certainty. One of the quickest methods, I call it a superpower for creating trust and likability, is asking great questions. Following that up by listening with curiosity. So Harvard did a research study where they went out and they had two groups of people. So in group A, they had people sit across the table from one another. They had 15 minutes to talk. And in that 15 minutes, there's one person asking questions. That person could ask no more than 4 questions. So 2 people, 15 minutes, asked no more than 4 questions. Group B, there were 15 minutes, 2 people. They had to ask at least 9 questions in that 15-minute span, right? So what did they find out? Well, they conduct these conversations, they analyze it. And what was reported back was the people that asked more questions received higher levels of trust and higher levels of likability. And so if there's anything that's proven to be a superpower to doing that, it's asking great questions because, well, let me bolt this on, because people love to talk about themselves. That's nothing too shocking, I don't think. But we also know from research that when you talk about yourself, it lights up the same areas of the brain as eating chocolate and sexual activity. I don't know if you like chocolate or like sexual activity. If you don't, know that most people do. And so when you get somebody to open up and talk about themselves, you're lighting up those same areas of the brain. You're getting them to relax. They're opening up. And now you've got them in a place where, and it's counterintuitive, but asking great questions and getting somebody to talk about themselves establishes trust and likability that you're searching for. Now, here's the other key to that. Is you're asking them questions. And when you do that, you're also uncovering important, valuable information that you need to know in order to solve their problems, in order to do planning for them, in order to know what's important to them. So as they start laying out, as you're asking these questions and getting them to talk about themselves and their situation and what brought them in, and not who's going to be the starting running back for the Patriots next year, they're saying, oh, okay, this guy's asking a bunch of great questions. He gets me. He understands my situation. And once they do that, they start kind of convincing themselves of like, I like this person. I trust this person. Listen to these good questions they're asking. Nobody's really thought to ask me this question before. And then once you do that, you buy yourself the chance when you get to explain how you can help. It's also proven that if you listen well and do a good job listening, when you finally do talk, people pay attention more. I'll leave you with this because I think it's such a great stat. I heard it from Moira Summers. She wrote a book called Advice That Sticks that everybody should read if they haven't. But she said that client satisfaction in the first meeting is directly related to the amount of airtime that the client gets. So it's not like how much you say, how much you impress them. They don't walk away satisfied because you told them about all the great things you do for people like them. It's the amount of airtime that they get. So what we always tell people is to strive for an 80-20 listen to talk ratio. 80 listen, 20 talk, because what's going to happen inevitably is you're not going to be that good. You're not going to be as good as you think you are. So you'll strive for 80-20. You'll probably land 60-40, maybe 70-30. 70-30 is probably fine. It's probably the sweet spot, but strive for 80-20. You'll land somewhere closer to where you need to be. But that's how you address what people want. They want trust. They want certainty. It's not by telling them how you can do it. It's by building trust, getting to know them, getting them to talk about themselves, and then they realize that you are the person that can give them a result that they need.
Hey, Model FAs. I know you're enjoying this conversation, but I wanted to take a quick break to talk to you about the Model FA Accelerator. This is a unique collaboration between us and you, where we help you build a financial advising practice that you can be proud of. We focus on the foundational concepts around how to pick a niche or a specialization, how to price your services, how to construct an offer that people are going to buy, and then how to market it and sell it in a way that'll get people to sign on the dotted line and become clients of your firm, all while giving you the information to scale and set up workflows and operational processes that'll allow you to reclaim your time and build a practice that doesn't run you. So if you'd like to hear more about that, go to www.modelfa.com/accelerator or www.modelfa.com. Hover over Work With Us and click on Accelerator. Hope to see you in the program.
So based on that, two things come to mind that I think would be relevant as a response. So one is, and perhaps you'd be a great guest on his show and he'd be a great guest on your show. We had someone on our show, Ivan Farber, around this time last year, and he wrote a book called Conversations, and it gives kind of a tactful guide and shares a number of different questions that you can weave into the conversation in order to build rapport and get these folks to like and trust you. So I think that is a great book for everyone listening to pick up and read or listen to. And even for you, Brendan, maybe complimentary. Yeah, for sure. So I wanted to state that. But then you also brought up an interesting point where, clients don't necessarily want to hear about, the holistic process that you go. It's important to bring that up at some point, but perhaps not the main focus of the conversation. So one thing that I have the folks that we consult, one thing that I have them do is that beginning portion of the meeting that an advisor's used to, where you talk about yourself and your firm and your process and all that type of stuff. That typically takes 7 to maybe 12, 15 minutes or so to kind of go through your whole spiel, if you will, because maybe there's pauses in between. They ask a question, you pause and ask them a question. So anyways, eats up, call it 10 minutes. So one thing that I suggest that folks do is they capture that in a video. So rather than saying, hey, Brendan, looking forward to our meeting coming up, they say, hey, looking forward to our meeting coming up, so they can repurpose it multiple times. And what they do is they capture that, and you could probably distill it down to like anywhere from like 3 to 7 minutes, maybe, if it's like, concise enough. And, they shoot them an email and say, hey, Brendan, here's a quick video just to give you some insight, about our firm and the process that we take folks through and some of my background as well. If you have a moment, please, watch it before we get together. I think it would really help set the stage, for our conversation. And what happens there is you have now taken that out of your process in terms of your time with them. So that's now freed up time to build rapport, right? You just found another 10 minutes. Number two, by them getting some exposure to your face and your voice and your mannerisms via video, it brings their guard down a little bit for when they actually do come into the office or hop on a Zoom call or whatever. And then finally, the other thing that it does is if you're meeting with them and for whatever reason, your firm, your process, or you don't resonate with them, they're not going to stop the meeting right there. And then you're stuck kind of spending, the other 40 minutes or so, with them. And they've already kind of made their decision at the beginning that they're not going to become a client. So there may be some instances where someone watches that video and they cancel the meeting because it did not resonate with them. Maybe they were, looking for a stock picker and, misinterpreted, what your role was, and they're going to cancel that meeting. And I don't view that as a bad thing because you most likely weren't going to get them to become a client anyways. So I view that as, okay, word, I just got, 60 minutes back into my calendar. So for all those reasons, I think that specific strategy with shaving that off, capturing it in a video, repurposing it saves time and builds rapport first and kind of qualifies them to a degree, or them being able to qualify you. And if they watch it and they like it and they keep the meeting, you increase the likelihood that they're going to actually do business. So I just wanted to kind of state those resource and idea, for that. So I guess.
Yeah. As you're talking about, I hear a bunch of different things. Well, the number one thing that keeps sticking out to me is like, yes, you may have been able to. So let's say that you don't do that. They come in, they're looking for a stock picker. Like you said, the fear is if I do that and they end up like it or they don't jive with it, that's what they're looking for, that I may miss the opportunity. Right. But what I would say is, you say you get 60 minutes of your time back. What I would say is if you ultimately convince them to become a client, that's not the client that you want. And you're going to be spending hours and hours with somebody that's not the type of person you want to work with. And that's going to flare up at times. Inevitably, if there's not an alignment there, it's going to flare up and it's going to cause friction and tension in whatever form that takes. It may not literally be like contentious conversations, but like it's not ideal. So it's a great way to filter out people. What I really like about it though, is that it lets them decide if they want to hear. You're not forcing it on them, right? You're saying, hey, if this is something that you want to know, you opt into this and decide if this is something that's important to you and you want to know. So the people that want to know get to hear it. They get to know why. By the way, if you're recording it, you get to practice it and repeat it. Like it's probably more polished than you on the fly anyway. So it's probably your best version of it, but you're not forcing it on anybody. You're literally just saying, hey, if you're interested and you want to opt into this, I mean, I use the term opt in, you want to choose to watch it, then the people that watch it, they're going to be interested in it. But the people that don't, that wasn't important to them anyway. So you're not wasting time talking about it when you actually get face-to-face time with them.
For sure. So we kind of, dove fairly deep into the discovery process. The main theme is, ask really great questions, not about their favorite football team necessarily as the example that you used, but more so about them and their journey and their why for wanting to have this meeting and wanting to, make sure that things were put into place appropriately. As far as the actual financial planning sort of, presentation meeting, what are ways that advisors can focus on the human aspect? Because that can honestly feel like it's more of a logical meeting because you're going through the planning, themes that you put together. You're putting together the recommendations. You're talking about that. You're talking about the asset allocation. It can be very logical. And some people just want to know what time it is. They don't necessarily want to know how the watch works. So how do you weave in the human component to the presentation meeting specifically?
Yeah, that's a really great question, right? Because if there was ever a point where you could say like, hey, all the technical knowledge is, well, first of all, technical knowledge is of utmost importance. I don't know why, maybe this is my own mental issue. I always feel the need at some point every time I'm on a podcast or giving a presentation or whatever to say, like, don't get me wrong. First and foremost, you have to have 100% fundamentally sound, great technical advice. Like that's bare minimum, right? Like, it's just the fact is that having the great technical advice, it's good, but it's not always sufficient to get people to do the things that they need to do. But let's make no mistake about it. It's not like, hey, get better at all these human side of advice, but just make sure your technical knowledge is, decent. It's like, no, that needs to be top notch first and foremost. And then this is stuff that you kind of like add onto it or layer into it. So again, maybe my own mental issue, but I always feel the need to clarify that so there's no confusion. But this is the stage of the planning and presenting. It's definitely can be the most bogged down, analytical, detailed portion of it. So the question is sort of like, okay, what can we do to bring the plan to life? How can we create some motion around the numbers? And the reality is you can't dodge the numbers, right? Like you can't, ultimately at the end of the day, we're still financial advisors and financial planners, and numbers are very much at the core of what we do. But the most important thing I think you can do through all that is assuming that you've done a good job of uncovering somebody's values, the things that are important to them, and uncovering their why. Or as Carl Richards, I like the way he puts it, he calls it giving somebody their statement of financial purpose, the why behind the reasons that they're doing what they're doing. I think the most important thing you can do is make sure that everything is looked through that lens, that you're always coming back to. We're doing this because you said this was important. So you told me that it was important to be able to or here, I'll give you an example. You do want to help somebody retire, but that's vague. We're looking for vivid specifics and clarity. So you want to go from somebody saying, I want to retire, to them saying, hey, this is the example I always use if anybody's heard it before, just bear with me. But I think it's one of the best ones I've used at this point. So I recycle it all the time. But you don't want to help somebody retire. You want to help them go to Disney World twice a year with their kids and their grandkids, stay at the Swan and Dolphin Hotel, eat out at these restaurants, and come home at nights and play game night around the table with our favorite beverages and favorite foods. That's what they're retiring to, right? That's the vision. And so when you're talking about getting somebody to start saving a little bit more, you've now given them a bigger why in terms of saving. And so when they're looking at, do I buy this new car? It's got this nice new car smell. It's not buying a new car, the new car smell compared to this vague, far off vision of retirement. It's buying this new car or spending 2 times a year in Disney World with my family, eating at these restaurants, staying at the Swan and Dolphin Hotel, and playing games around the table at night. You can see where now the competing interest is a lot stronger. You've given somebody a bigger why. So when you're going through the plan, you're making recommendations, it's always important to either point out or tie it back to the why, the purpose behind what they're doing, or to make sure you start with the purpose so that now colors the rest of the conversation. So that when you make a recommendation of doing something, it's now that you've got the why to drive it. You've got the why behind it to power it through. The second thing I would say is the more stories you can tell, the better. So stories are basically a way to essentially plant your emotion in somebody else's brain. I won't get into all the research and science behind it, but it's a way to transport emotion and have somebody feel what you're feeling or what they should be feeling. So the more stories you can tell around somebody else like them that did something similar, because we all want to know what people like us are doing, the more effective the delivery of that's going to be. But that's secondary. The first most important thing is to always tie everything to the why. And one of the better ideas I've heard is when you make a recommendation. Now, a lot of people say yeah, I have this list of to-dos. So I'll make a recommendation, give them an action item, tell them to do this, or I'll even say, here are our action items. Here's who's going to do it. So I do these things. The client does these other things. Here's the date that it needs to be done by. Well, why not add one more column and say, hey, here's what needs to be done. Here's who's going to do it. Here's the date that it needs to be done by. Oh, and by the way, here's why we're doing it. Because by saving $1,000 more a month, you need to do that. We're going to make sure you do it. Make sure you put that in place about next month, but we're doing it because you said that you want to be able to host your family every week on your deck for barbecue nights. And you don't have a deck yet. You need to fund your deck. This $1,000 is going towards funding your deck. So it can be something as simple as in the recommendation phase, tying the recommendation to the why very explicitly. So there's no question why it's being done.
Which you can't do that if you don't do a good job in the discovery meeting. So I think it exactly emphasizes the point that you were sharing earlier in regards to asking those great questions and truly understanding what retirement or whatever goal they have is important to try and understand, not just sticking with the same Disney example, not just the fact that they want to go to Disney, but what does that provide for them and their family, and what does that experience look like? What do they like to do when they're there? And I can see how that not only gets their buy-in, but it also limits the amount of objections that you get around strategy or pricing or whatever it may be. And it also, from what I'm hearing, it also can make their ability to introduce you to other folks in their world easier, because when they're asked about their experience in working with you, they say, well, long story short, Brendan is making sure that we go to Disney World a couple times a year and that, we never have to stress financially about that, as opposed to trying to task them with explaining exactly what you do, which you've spent years in developing that skill set and knowledge, and expecting, these folks who don't necessarily have the experience or knowledge in our industry, to try and distill that into a compelling statement to get that person to meet with you.
Yeah.
So I can see how it helps with introductions as well.
So it's almost like, I don't know, this is pretty impressive. You keep teeing me up with other things that I want to mention. So I appreciate that. But here's what we know too, that I think is fascinating. I can't believe it hasn't been more spread around, published, talked about in our industry. But Harvard Business Review, they did another study. I promise I look at more studies than just Harvard Business Review, but those tend to be pretty good. They did a study where they found that emotionally connected clients, not just in financial services, but in general, but they also looked at financial services, but emotionally connected clients. So not satisfied people, not satisfied clients, emotionally connected clients that knew their why and the reason behind what they're doing, were more likely to pay more, refer more. So to your point, you should get more referrals, pay more, refer more, consolidate assets and follow through on advice. And so if you were to sit there, if you and I were to sit here and go, hey, what would be the ideal client profile aside from like, the phase of life and their financial planning topics? You would basically say, we want people that they're willing to pay. They're going to refer us to their friends. They consolidate all their assets to us. And by the way, you're not going to have to send them 6 follow-up emails to get them to do something. You would literally say like, those are 4 pretty great things. So to your point about getting more introductions, getting more referrals, obviously like that's a key growth component for most people in this industry, most businesses, that you have emotionally connected clients. You're getting more referrals because like you said, they're not saying, hey, yeah, Brendan's our guy. He gives us a financial plan. It's Brendan's our guy. He made it. He helped us figure out that we wanted to go to Disney World every couple of years and told us how to make it happen. And one of those 2 things, I'll let you decide. One of those 2 things is a lot more compelling than the other. And of those 2, most advisors that I know anyways, that I'm familiar and comfortable with or familiar with and have known, most of them are doing one of those things and most of them aren't doing the other.
I think too, and one thing I want to mention as a shameless plug before we pivot here in a second, questions that you may be asking yourself as you're listening to this is, okay, well, that sounds great, but what questions do I ask? So if you would like, we've put together a document that has over 100 questions that you can ask in a discovery meeting. Obviously, you're not asking all 100 questions, but you get to pick and choose. And so if you shoot me an email to david@modelfa.com, and just in the subject line, write Brendan Frazier, Frazier, 100 questions in the subject line, I'll reply with that PDF to you. That way you at least have a starting point to, start building up your repository of questions if you want to start implementing this into your business.
If anybody's listening and doesn't do that, you're crazy. I'm not just saying that either. I don't know why you wouldn't want that. I guarantee there's a question on there that's better than one of the questions that you can add to what you're already asking, I guess.
And it's free. It's the only thing that it costs is a couple minutes for me to reply, and I'm happy to invest that time. So, but with that being said, I do want to pivot. So one thing that we ask all of our guests, and it's a way to distill a reading list for the folks to, learn some more, perhaps inside of our industry, outside of our industry. So I always ask our guests what one of their favorite books is. And Brendan, you had mentioned the book, How to Talk So Kids Will Listen and Listen So Kids Will Talk. Tell me why you picked that as your book that you want to talk about.
Yeah. So asking me what my favorite book is actually gives me a little bit of, if that was a question that I got asked, it gives me a little bit of anxiety because I'm like, dang, I don't know how to narrow it down. I don't know how to pick.
That's why I include that in our intake form. So you have some time to think about it and not putting you on the spot.
Yeah, but I still don't even I think that's still my answer. I still don't feel good about it. I'm going to parlay this back for a second. That's when you ask people what their top goals are. What are your top priorities? It's they have the same response. They have the same reaction. Most people don't sit around thinking about what their number one financial goal is in life. Right. And then they kind of give you the answer that they think they should give, or it could be you know what? I probably answered that question right after I'd read a chapter of that book. And so I'm like, you know what? Right. That's the one. Right. Because so anyways, I'll just say this. And again, we'll go shameless plug land here for a second. But so for anybody that's interested, that wants to know books, podcasts, articles on the human side of advice, we have a whole page on our website under the resources tab of we're always curating, going through and adding the best podcast articles and books on the topic. So you can go there and check that out if you're interested in learning more about this stuff. But yeah, so that book, it's 100% relevant, or it came to mind 100% because we have a 3.5-year-old and a 1.5-year-old in our house. And we're in the throes of learning that you can't just, there's ways to communicate more effectively, I guess I'd say. And so Samantha Russell, if you're familiar with Samantha, she's the one that pointed it out to me. And so I'm reading it just as a parent, trying to get better at when my kid's losing his mind because we gave him a blue plate instead of a green plate to eat his breakfast off of. How do I handle that without telling him that he's losing his mind? I can't stand it, which is still a work in progress. So I'm reading it for that reason. And then she had told me this, but I didn't really know. You start reading it and you go, wait a minute. These are actual effective communication principles, not just for dealing with kids, but for dealing with anybody, learning how to actually listen, to not to respond, but to hear what they're saying, hear what they're wanting you to feel when they're telling you things. It's littered with all these things where I'm reading it and I have 2 notes. One is how can I use it with my kids? And the other is how can I use it with my clients? How can I use it in business and in life? And so it's just cool. If you have kids, you're going to be a better parent as a result. If you don't, you're going to become a better communicator as a result. So that's why that came. I also want to say that the option number 2 on that list, or 1B, would be The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. So it just, I mean, by far and away, one of the best books I think I've ever read.
It could even be, because I've read that book as well, Psychology of Money. It could even be a part of like a welcome kit for clients. That way they can kind of get bought in with that too.
And I know people that do that. I know a lot of advisors that's kind of they send that to their clients once they onboard them.
For sure. Well, awesome, man. This has been fun. It's been very insightful. I think it's always good to kind of pause and say, okay, let's assume that we're up to speed with how to be a financial advisor from a logical and technical point of view. But I think it's always is a good time to remind folks that, hey, there is a human component and you are dealing with emotions and feelings. And if you can master that, assuming that you have the technical know-how, you're going to increase the likelihood that someone's going to do business with you because they have a great experience with you. So with that being said, went to give yourself a shameless plug, but you didn't say what the website was. What's the website and where else do you want to send folks to before we wrap up?
Yeah, clearly I'm not well-versed in shameless plugs. I need to practice that a little bit more. Yeah, so the website's wiredplanning.com. We also send out an email once a month to people that say, hey, I know I need to get better at this. I just don't really know where to start or how to apply it. Right. It's like I could read books and stuff, but I don't really know exactly how to use it in my conversations and in my practice. So we send an email once a month with that. And then the podcast is called The Human Side of Money. So you can check that out too, if this is the kind of stuff you're interested in. And then I'm pretty active on both LinkedIn and Twitter if anybody wants to connect that way.
Awesome. And for those of you who are listening, big thank you for spending the time. Hopefully you got some nuggets from this episode. I know I did. So I would make it a point that before you move on to your next task, whatever's on your list of things to do today, pause, reflect on what you learned, and then put together a plan of action to actually implement this into your business. And perhaps that action step is subscribing to, Brendan's email that he just mentioned, subscribing to his podcast. Perhaps it's emailing me at david@modelfa.com to ask for the 100 questions that I referenced earlier, to just make sure that although we appreciate you listening, regardless of the intentions, we'd like it more if you listened with the intent to implement exactly what you learned. So with that being said, if you would be so kind as to share this episode, with someone that you think would find it to be helpful, please do. Also, if you go ahead and leave us a review on iTunes, that would really help with overall listenership and exposure of the show. And as a thank you for doing so, if you leave a review, screenshot that once it posts, and then shoot me a text with that screenshot and just put Brendan Frazier in the text to 978-228-2338. Again, that's 978-228-2338. What will happen is you'll get an automatic reply with a link to input your first and last name. That will add you to my contacts. And then beyond that automated reply, it's actually me texting you back and forth. And I, send out motivational or inspirational message on a daily basis just to get your day going. So anticipate that as well. But for the first 5 people that do that, I referenced earlier in the conversation a book by Ivan Farber called Conversation. So between the books that Brendan had recommended, that book and the 100 questions, this is an episode in which we are trying our best to provide resources. So for the first 5 people who do text me a screenshot of that review with Brendan's name on it, I'll go ahead and send you a copy of Ivan's book, Conversations, as a thank you for doing so. And if you're, an Audible listener and not as much of a reader, you can just let me know that too. And I'll, make sure to get the Audible version for you as well. So with that being said, a little bit of a long-winded ending, but I think that it was important to highlight some of the resources that you have at your disposal to really elevate the human side of advice within your business. So with that being said, Brendan, appreciate your time today. Appreciate the insights and glad we finally got to do an episode together.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. It was fun.
Awesome. Take care.